Harder! Deeper! Yes, baby, right there! Gina exclaimed, leaning over Mark, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. Mark, sweat pouring down his brow, pushed harder on the large old safe, grunting from the effort. Almost there. Just a little more, he muttered, hands gripping the metal lock. With one final twist, the lock clicked open. Mark jumped back, wide-eyed, as the safe creaked, revealing bundles of cash stuffed inside. Gina's face lit up as she peered into the safe. "We did it, Mark! The dough's ready," she whispered, running her fingers through the stacks of cash. The couple had come a long way from their early days of small scams, phony investment deals, fake charities, and sob stories. This, however, was the big score they had been waiting for, a huge payday from swindling, unsuspecting rich folks. "You really know how to pick 'em, babe," Mark said with a grin, admiring Gina's crafty mind. This old guy had no idea what hit him. They shared a brief laugh, celebrating their latest con, unaware of the trouble they had just brought upon themselves. Gina and Mark had already built a reputation for their slick scams. One of their most notorious and profitable was their con targeting married women. It was a well-thought-out hustle that required charm, deception, and just the right amount of manipulation. It started with Gina posing as an elite wedding planner and relationship coach for wealthy, bored housewives. She would arrange private consultations in upscale hotels, where she promised to help them rekindle the passion in their marriages, offering exclusive services that came with a hefty price tag. Her meetings were perfectly curated, complete with wine, candlelight, and just enough flattery to make the women feel like royalty. Mark's role? To swoop in as the mysterious, attractive associate who could solve the women's issues in more personal ways. Their strategy was simple but effective. Make the women believe they were receiving advice and guidance that their husbands were too oblivious to offer. Gina would subtly plant the seed of doubt. Perhaps their husbands were cheating, or maybe they were unappreciated at home, and then recommend her associate, Mark, who could offer a discreet service. Mark would meet them under the guise of being a charming professional, offering them companionship, listening ears, and, on occasion, more than a few romantic promises. One by one, the wives fell into their web. They believed that with Gina's advice and Mark's attention, they were not just fixing their marriages, they were becoming more empowered. But all the while, Gina and Mark were taking payments in cash, convincing the women to hand over thousands for exclusive retreats and personal transformation sessions. There was the case of Mrs. Johnson, a wealthy banker's wife who was convinced that her husband had grown cold. Gina had nudged Mrs. Johnson just enough for her to believe that maybe, just maybe, her husband had a mistress. Desperate, Mrs. Johnson turned to Gina, and in turn, Gina sent her to Mark. It was all too easy. A few words of flattery, some intimate dinners, and Mrs. Johnson was handing over money like it was nothing. In total, they got almost 2 million naira from her alone, promising a grand marriage restoration retreat that never existed. But it wasn't just Mrs. Johnson. Soon, their roster of victims grew. The women paid handsomely, and Gina and Mark knew exactly how to avoid suspicion. Each scam was carefully timed and executed before the women could realize they'd been duped. Yet their downfall came with a certain Mrs. Eniola, the sharp-tongued wife of a local politician. Mrs. Eniola had attended one of Gina's so-called relationship transformation weekends, where she had dropped nearly 5 million naira. Mark, in his usual smooth fashion, played the part of a confidant, but Mrs. Eniola wasn't as naive as the others. After a few meetings, she started asking too many questions, becoming suspicious of why none of the promises materialized. "We need to wrap this up with her. She's too smart," Gina warned Mark one evening, after Mrs. Eniola had sent yet another text asking about the next retreat. "We'll return some of the money, throw in a few excuses, and get her off our backs," Mark replied. But it was too late. Mrs. Eniola, having connected the dots, had friends in high places and managed to get a private investigator involved. Gina and Mark were able to slip away just in time, but it was clear their scam with the married women had reached its end. "That was too close," Mark said as they fled the city for a while, heading to a more discreet neighborhood. Gina agreed, her mind racing with thoughts of their next move. "Well, have to find bigger, safer Marks from now on. No more housewives." And that's when Mr. Ogundipe came into the picture. A week later, Gina had caught wind of Mr. Ogundipe, a wealthy old man eager to invest his life savings. This seemed like the perfect opportunity. An older man, easily trusting and with deep pockets. Gina and Mark prepared their scam, thinking it would be just another easy hit. They set up a meeting at his grand mansion, and with their usual charm and confidence, they laid out a fake financial plan, convincing him that they could double his investments. Mr. Ogundipe, unsuspecting, handed over his life savings, thinking he was making a wise decision for his future. But they had no idea that this scam would be their last. The weeks after the scam were a nightmare for Mr. Ogundipe. Day after day, he waited for word from Gina and Mark, but it never came. His calls went unanswered, and the more he tried to reach them, the more he realized something was wrong. His heart sank. He had been scammed. At first, he was in denial. How could this happen to him, a man who had lived his life cautiously and wisely? He visited their office, only to find it abandoned. Panic set in as the full weight of the situation hit him. His life savings were gone, and with it, his plans for a peaceful retirement. Unable to sleep, eat, or think of anything else, Mr. Ogundipe fell into despair. Friends and family tried to console him, but he couldn't bear the thought of living in poverty after working so hard his entire life. Everything he had worked for was gone in an instant, stolen by two smooth-talking thieves. Desperate for answers, Mr. Ogundipe began searching for any solution. And that's when he remembered his roots, the traditions of his ancestors, and the power that resided in the village he had left behind long ago. There was a man, a traditional priest known as Baba Adebayo, who had been the go-to for generations whenever things were beyond human control. He was said to possess powers that could alter destinies and call upon the spirits to bring justice. With nothing left to lose, Mr. Ogundipe packed his bags and made the long journey back to his village. The road to the village was bumpy, and the journey felt like it stretched on forever. As the scenery changed from the city's chaos to the serene but rugged countryside, Mr. Ogundipe's thoughts drifted between anger and sorrow. How could he have been so foolish to trust those con artists? When he finally arrived at the village, he was greeted by old faces, some who remembered him from his youth. The village elders directed him to the priest's home, a small but imposing compound at the edge of the village. Baba Adebayo was an old man, with a weathered face. His eyes held centuries of wisdom, as if he had seen every possible way someone could be wronged, and every possible way they could seek justice. Baba Adebayo stood silently for a moment, sizing up Mr. Ogundipe. The older man, still trembling from his ordeal, had come here as a last resort, but he had faith that the priest could bring the scammers to their knees. "They have wronged you deeply," Baba Adebayo finally said, his voice steady, yet filled with a quiet fury. "The gods will not stand for it. You have come to the right place." Mr. Ogundipe let out a breath he hadn't realized had been holding. He nodded, barely able to speak. His entire body was tense, still weighed down by the loss of his life savings. After all his hard work and careful planning, it had only taken Gina and Mark a few sweet words to strip him of everything. But here, in this small village at the edge of the world, he finally felt a glimmer of hope. Baba Adebayo gestured for him to follow, leading him into the heart of the compound. The air inside the priest's home was thick with incense, the earthy smell of burning herbs permeating the room. Every inch of the walls was covered with symbols and carvings, ancient markings that seemed to pulse with power. The priest sat down cross-legged before an altar covered in clay pots and cowrie shells. As he began to chant, the room grew even heavier with the presence of the spirits. Mr. Ogundipe could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The air seemed to hum with energy, vibrating with a force beyond his comprehension. "They will be punished," Baba Adebayo said, still in a trance-like state. "For their deception, they will be transformed. Until they return what they have stolen, they will no longer be fully human. They will feel the weight of their crime in every step they take." Mr. Ogundipe's heart raced as he listened. The idea of revenge had never seemed so real, so tangible. This wasn't just about getting his money back. This was about restoring his dignity and making sure that Gina and Mark paid for what they had done. Baba Adebayo's eyes snapped open, glowing with an otherworldly light. "I will call upon the spirits to bind them to their crime. They will live as half humans, half frogs, until they return every last naira they stole from you." With that, Baba Adebayo rose and began preparing the ritual. He gathered sacred herbs, sprinkling them into the clay pots, and lit several candles. The chanting resumed, growing louder and more intense with every word. Mr. Ogundipe watched in awe as the room seemed to shift around him, the walls bending, the air growing thick with the presence of the spirits. He could feel them, powerful, ancient forces, watching, waiting. The priest spoke directly to the spirits now, calling upon them to deliver justice. These thieves who have taken what is not theirs, they will live in disgrace until they return the wealth they have stolen. Let their bodies transform. Let them suffer the consequences of their greed. As the final words left Baba Adebayo's lips, the air seemed to crackle with energy. The ritual was complete. Mr. Ogunpe felt a surge of relief wash over him. The curse was set. Gina and Mark had no idea what was coming. Back in their apartment, celebrating their latest success, strange things began to happen. Gina noticed her hands becoming slimy and her fingers webbing together. Mark, too, felt his legs changing, his feet transforming into flippers. They were turning into frogs. But as the days went by, strange things began to happen. At first it was small, the occasional croak escaping Gina's throat when she laughed, a slimy texture to Mark's skin that he couldn't wash off. They both shrugged it off, chalking it up to stress or paranoia. Then, one evening as they lay in bed counting their stolen fortune, the changes became undeniable. Gina's hands started to stick together, her fingers webbing like a frog's feet. Mark's legs felt strange, shorter, almost as if they were shrinking. Their breathing became labored, and their voices became less human, more like the rivets of an amphibian. "What's happening to us?" Gina croaked, her voice trembling with fear. She stared down at her now partially webbed hands, her heart racing in terror. Mark looked at her, his face pale as his own legs started to change. This can't be real. This is some kind of nightmare," he stammered, but the reality was undeniable. Panic struck as the room filled with a booming voice. Mr. Ogundipe appeared before them, accompanied by a traditional priest. "You think you can steal from me and get away with it?" Mr. Ogundipe asked, his face calm but stern. The priest stepped forward, his eyes glowing with power. "This curse will remain until every last naira is returned," he said, his voice echoing. "Fail to do so, and you will remain in this half-human, half-frog state." The room fell silent as Mr. Ogundipe and the priest vanished, leaving Mark and Gina alone to face their fate. As days passed, Gina and Mark's transformation worsened. Their bodies became more frog-like with every hour, and they realized that they had no choice but to return the stolen money. Desperation set in. They sold everything they had bought with Mr. Ogundipe's money, returned some of it, and ran more small cons to gather the rest. The more they struggled, the more frog-like they became, croaking uncontrollably as their skin grew slimier. After a week of frantic scrambling, they finally had enough to return the full amount. Barely able to stand upright, they hopped their way back to Mr. Ogundipe's mansion. When they arrived, the priest and Mr. Ogundipe were waiting for them. With trembling hands, they returned the money, croaking out their apologies. The priest, seeing their sincerity, raised his hand and chanted a spell. Slowly, their bodies began to revert to human form. The slimy skin disappeared, their legs straightened, and their voices returned to normal. "You have learned your lesson," the priest said, his voice soft but stern. "Do not steal what is not yours.